Welcome to the 2017 Swanberg Lecture in Military History. First, we must thank our distinguished alumnus, Arnold Swanberg, whose generosity has made this lecture possible. Without him, Professor Showalter would not be here. Diane Rapp, our Thank you, Arnold. Diane Rapp, our administrative assistant, has graciously assisted with the details. We must also acknowledge the cheerful technical assistance of Alan Torgeson of the Denison Theater. And this event will be videotaped by the Missoula Community Access Television as part of its media assistance grants programs to nonprofit organizations. So many thanks to MCAT who have supported us today and in the past. We are privileged to have with us this evening Professor Dennis Showalter. After receiving a BA at St. John's University, an MA and a PhD from the University of Minnesota, Professor Showalter moved to Colorado College, where he garnered a number of teaching awards. He also served as Distinguished Visiting Professor at the United States Military Academy, West Point, and subsequently, they know a good thing when they had it, as McDermott Chair there. He also taught at the Marine Corps University as the H.L. Oppenheim Professor and as visiting professor and distinguished visiting professor at the United States Air Force Academy. Being myself a part of West Point, I'm happy to say he was never at the Naval Academy. This distinguished teaching career was coupled with impressive scholarly achievements. His work has been funded by an NEH Fellowship, an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, among others. His many works include the definitive work on the wars of Frederick the Great, a book on Hindenburg, one on Patton and Rommel, which had the distinction of coming out in English, Spanish, Polish, Japanese, and Korean editions, and was selected for the History Book Club and the Military Book Club. Armor and Blood on the Battle of Kursk, one of the greatest tank battles during World War II, has also appeared, as has Instrument of War, the German Army. I'm not listing all of them, I'm just giving you a soupçon, so to speak, so you're tempted. To name but a few of the honors his books have won, they've been the Samuel Eliot Morrison Achievement Award, the Clio Award, the Paul Birdsall Prize from the AHA, the Tomlinson Prize of the World War I Historical Association for the best historical work. He has influenced the field not only by his writing, but also by his tireless service. Few, if any, in the field of military history have influenced so many men and women. He has served as trustee and subsequently president of the Society for Military History, joint editor of War and Society and War and History, editor-in-chief of Oxford Bibliographies on Military History, among others. What does not appear in the written testimonial is his unfailing graciousness, kindness, and assistance to younger scholars. One of the graduates from the University of Montana, our own Jesse, has profited from Dennis's kindness. He has shepherded many young scholars through the often daunting publication of their manuscripts, and as you will see, he is legendary for his acerbic wit and self-deprecatory humor. I have the real honor to welcome Dennis Showalter.
And ladies and gentlemen, thanks to Professor Fry, thanks to Mr. Swanberg. The honor is really mine. It is a great privilege to be here tonight, a great privilege to deliver this lecture, and a great privilege to exchange ideas with an audience of people that are interested in this subject. Now, you have a situation looking at the Great War. And we normally think of the Great War as a mass war. In a sense, indeed, the title's a cliche. When we visualize World War I, our images are of masses of soldiers, guns, warships, and masses as well of bodies and of graves. The defining sites of the Great War's memory and mourning are cemeteries. Cemeteries whose size it really staggers the imagination. And anybody who has ever been at Verdun, Ypres, the Somme, anybody who's ever even seen documentaries of those will get the sense that one moves almost literally from graveyard to graveyard. And indeed, World War I was a mass war whose roots were deep in the long 19th century, the period from 1789 to 1914. And I think we can find three general characteristics of World War I as a mass war that come out of the 19th century. Number one is numbers, the exponential increase in the size of armed forces. And that began with simultaneous revolutions in agricultural and industrial production. Armies historically existed in the context of economies that were muscle-powered and societies that were labor short. And a day's work depended essentially on what a man could do with his own arms, his legs, and his back. Now, in an emerging age of mechanization, it's becoming possible to remove large numbers, indeed a majority of young and healthy males, from the economy for relatively long periods of time. Nor are these numbers merely inchoate armed hordes. The industrial and agricultural revolutions sent men off to war better equipped and supplied than ever before. Europe's manufacturing capacity accelerated technical innovations that multiplied the effectiveness of armies' weapons, enhanced their mobility, provided electronic nervous systems, more mundanely but no less significant, medicine and chemistry, mitigated the impact of disease and wounds. So first we have numbers, and you might say effective numbers. They're not dropping dead or starving. The second factor that's involved here, numbers are complemented by organization. In the long 19th century, administration generally, and military administration in particular, randomness and peculation give way to bureaucratic discipline and fiscal honesty, at least relative fiscal honesty. Standardized procedures and systems underpin structures and institutions. You can say, too, that these standardized institutions enable the maintenance of ever larger, increasingly complex armed forces over a period of time, and create cultures of competence that enhance the credibility of these armed forces on the part of their rank and file members. Material and administrative developments, in turn, nurture collective identities. And local loyalties in this long century increasingly shift to the states that now provide positive benefits in return for the taxes they collect and the drafts that they levy. Subjects are becoming citizens, a process directly facilitated by the spread of public education, a public education structured to foster civic enthusiasm and national identity. In short, between 1789 and 1914, that 1960s aphorism, "Suppose they gave a war and no one came," was becoming a concept both impractical and unthinkable. So we have first the numbers, then we have the structure, the organization. And those two lead us to modern wars, mass wars, third foundation, and that is demographics. There were, as I said a minute ago, simply a lot of men to mobilize. And it's possible to speak in a global context of a demography of domination by the end of the 19th century, where there are 300 million Europeans confronting populations that in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, are often smaller, more sparsely distributed. And certainly, that balance of numbers between the West and the rest is more than sufficient to support an imperialism which is largely based on administration rather than settlement. Translated from professor into English, in Asia, South Asia, Africa, there's relatively little settlement. It's a matter of governance. And in Australia, I should have said Africa, South Asia, Africa, in Canada and Australia, North America generally, even South America, settlements tend to take place in a relative vacuum and involve displacing populations, crowding them in as opposed to eliminating them. So you have a situation again in which demographics support mass. Where once states counted their military strength in tens of thousands, they can calculate in terms of hundreds of thousands, then of millions. And increasingly, in that context, finesse gives way to force. Comprehensively to force. On the battlefield, in strategic planning, in diplomatic levels, and eventually during the Great War, force even holding society together. So these three general characteristics then, the issue of numbers, the issue of structure, and the issue of global demographics they define mass war, but they lead also to specific characterizations of mass war, specific features. The three I've cited are generic to war from the French Revolution to the end of the Great War and beyond. The two we'll be picking up now are essentially specific to the Great War, and in that sense, we have to understand the Great War as a war of long duration. Well before 1914, what has been described as the short war illusion is becoming really the short war desire. Even the German General Staff is moving towards consideration and acceptance of a conflict of the long duration. A prophetic work of fiction, a short story called The Green Curve, published in 1909, focuses on the inexorability of materially based attrition. That's the green curve of the title, a curve that shows up on charts until the siege ends when the curve runs off at the bottom. Polish-Jewish banker Mark Bloch developed this concept in a larger, more statistically based work. So, a war then of long duration, structured by the 3 points that I made. So far, so good? All right. Let's take a look then at what characterized this war of long duration. First, the nature of the battlefield. And what we see are 2 points here. The nature of the battlefield is shaped by a drastic imbalance in the operational triad of mobility, protection, and firepower. Since the introduction of gunpowder, mobility, protection, and firepower had been more or less a scalene triangle with flexible sides and angles. Between 1914 and 1915, that scalene triangle hardened into an obtuse triangle with firepower as the wide angle that sometimes approximated 150 degrees. Sometimes even if you're not mathematically inclined, it's easier to identify, easier to get the idea of a triangle where the obtuse angle overshadows the other two. And in the Great War, that obtuse angle is firepower. Virtu, whether expressed as courage or cunning, correspondingly gives place in the battlefield to weight of shells and number of bodies. And related to that is a second point. As the scale of war making increases, command and control fail to keep pace. Real-time information is most of the time impossible to obtain or process in any systematic fashion. So the result is a growing emphasis on planning. If you can't trust your instincts, if you can't trust your good eye, if you can't trust your guts, then you have to trust planning. You have to trust planning on paper. You have to trust systematic preparation. So the nature of the battlefield, the nature of the battlefield shapes the Great War. A second thing that shapes the Great War is the symmetry of systems. The armed forces involved are symmetrical to a degree not unique, but certainly very unusual. Not since the middle of the 18th century did like confront like across the lines of combat. The differences among European armies are essentially inconsequential. Yes, there are some differences, but they're sort of like the old line from Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other, and one of them is not the same, and it can be very difficult to decide which one is not the same. Now, that symmetry was institutional, and it was facilitated by intense competition among armed forces in the context of open societies, where information about one's neighbor's military preparation is available to a previously unknown degree. The result is mutual homogenization, rivalries focusing on details at the expense of thinking outside the box. And translated to the battlefield, this produces a war of nuances, a war of seeking small advantages that somehow might be expanded into decision. So first, as I tried to suggest, the firepower revolution leads to an emphasis on planning. Symmetry leads to emphasis on nuance. And the third factor is the importance of community. Now, before 1914, a factor often overlooked that historians often overlook in considering the war plans of the nations was a subtext that future conflict would be so horrible that the home front would collapse under the stress. Instead, by 1915, it's apparent that the generals and the politicians can count on unprecedented and unexpected commitment from their populations. Now, the precise mix of patriotism, conformity, and passivity underpinning that phenomenon still remains debatable. It's a subject that will be providing material for PhD generations for a good way down the line. But within a matter of months, the intended cabinet wars that the sleepwalkers described as Europe just sort of stumbling into, these intended cabinet wars become really people's wars in which domestic enemies unite the force to face a common foe whose triumph they see as fatal to their own societies. Now, this provides a tremendous impetus to a forged weapon that, as we say, involves firepower, involves homogeneity, and involves simply weight of numbers. And almost automatically, that weapon is turned over to the soldiers in the autumn of 1914. The problem is not that the soldiers don't know what to do with it. They accept responsibility for this, but they are shaken. Armed forces are shaken by the very limited results. There's a real issue of breach of faith here. Sometimes, again, we are so prone to see the generals of the First World War as donkeys, in effect, people with no imagination and no common sense. It's easy to forget that almost all of them, have their own morality, have their own conscience, and they develop commitments to bringing their states to victory, and they can't do it. They're unable to do it. So here again, we'll repeat it, the nature of the battlefield, the symmetry of military systems, and home front communities create a situation that the military establishment is not able to solve. And that brings us, in my judgment, to the area, the two things that shape mass war. What I suggested earlier is mass war is defined by these three greater things. Numbers, the issue of numbers, the issue of symmetry, the issue of commitment. That defines mass war. But mass war is shaped by two other factors, and one comes out of the military establishment. And that factor is what I call a flexibility of desperation. A flexibility of desperation. In his classic work, The General, C.S. Forrester, the creator of Horatio Hornblower, describes the generals as like people who are ignorant of screws, seeking to remove one by direct force. A simpler version of the trope, a man named Arthur Clarke spoke of lions led by donkeys. Any of you that have ever seen the British Blackadder Goes Forth series, or Joan Littlefield's Oh, What a Lovely War, and you get the idea. Well, almost from the beginning, in fact, the combatants were rapidly modifying doctrines, weapons, and machines in a desperate effort to shorten a conflict that was metastasizing out of control and producing levels of casualties and destruction that often shocked even the generals. Flamethrowers, gas, submarines, tanks, all of them were seized on as nearly literal gods from the machine. But technological possibilities are limited by what you might call material factors or objective factors. To cite the most obvious example, the internal combustion engine is in the first stages of its reliability, and its horsepower and reliability are alike too limited to restore mobility or to enable protection. And so we see a pattern of new technical devices, again, tanks and aircraft particularly, that are introduced, replaced by new versions, but no decisive change. So technologically, again, the flexibility of desperation. Armed forces also adjust institutionally. They adjust institutionally to the challenges of stagnation, the gridlock, trench warfare. Cavalry are turned into infantry. Flash and sound raising and air observation revolutionizes artillery fire direction and the nature of artillerymen. Gunners who before the First World War had been as horse-obsessed as the cavalry are now morphing into scientists and mathematicians by 1918. Artillery and air assets are centralized or decentralized. Again, the administration, the organization changes depending on the perceived needs. The basic tactical unit, which started as the battalion of 1,000, the company of 200, devolves first to the platoon, and by late 1918 to the squad, a dozen men with an organic light machine gun. You don't have to be an order of battle junkie or hobbyist to see here that in these again, structural and institutional patterns, to see a pattern of flexibility that involves almost desperately adapting to the changing circumstances, now or to the conditions of war. In secondary theaters, we see the same kind of flexibility. In Mesopotamia, the British respond to the terrain and the climate by motorizing almost all of their rear echelon transport. In Palestine, aircraft team with armored cars and horse cavalry and machine guns during Edmund Allenby's final campaign. In Romania, the Germans employ in 1916 a rudimentary motorized battle group with disproportionate effect. And I could multiply examples. We certainly see it. We see it in naval war as well, where submarines and aircraft begin reshaping the patterns of naval engagement. But the one thing all of these innovations have in common is that they are limited, specific. You might even say embryonic. The Brits and French, the Brits in particular, probably make the most significant contribution to future wars by developing in 1918 the first modern combined arms teams, integrating infantry, artillery, tanks, and air power, coordinating them more or less by radio, which is still in the embryonic stage, but now can be used for ground communication. Within the artillery zone, the tanks seek targets of opportunity, the infantry probe for soft spots, each supports the other as needed. Aircraft provide reconnaissance, observation, and increasingly ground support. But the thing is, the complex interaction of those arms could not be controlled, as opposed to supervised, with the communications technology of 1918. Radios are still bulky and unreliable, but you can at least monitor operations to a point where it's possible to talk, as David Zabecki does, of a semi-managed battle, with attacks able to move forward at a lurching progress, able to push back the German front, but never to rupture it. The gains of Amiens, August 8th, the so-called Black Day of the German Army, the gains of Amiens were deceiving. Neither the tactics nor the technology of 1918 were quite up to breaching even improved defensive positions, even improvised, I should have said, defensive positions at an acceptable cost. What they could do was maintain a steady pressure that compelled an eroding German army to fall back steadily enough that finally the generals demanded that the government sue for peace rather than risk an all-out conflict, an all-or-nothing endgame on German soil. And underpinning this hardware lecture, these 5 minutes of discussion of the hardware, is the fact that even in the war's final stages, method and technology could not significantly reduce casualties. They could only improve the ratio of gains. As French General Charles Maginot said, no matter what we do, you bleed a lot. And even very efficient units like the Canadian Corps are fought out between August and November 1918. The Meuse Argonne, the subject of last year's lecture, remains the single engagement that produced the largest number of casualties in American history, American military history. As General Maginot said, no matter what you do, you bleed a lot. So that leads to the second general shaping characteristic of World War I as a mass war, and that is semi-modernization. And to understand semi-modernization, we have to move from the generals to the politicians, roughly. Because as the generals seek to overcome their situation by improvisation from desperation, the political figures, and some military figures, seek to overcome that situation by expansion. If we can't get through in the West, we'll get through somewhere else. If we can't go through, we'll find a way around. And that certainly that can involve the Western allies supporting Russia. It can involve bringing Italy into the war. It involves the Middle East campaigns, the Dardanelles, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and the Balkan fronts, the Salonika, the world's biggest internment camp of the Allies on one hand, the Central Powers on the other. The scenario is familiar. The scenario is familiar. The subtext of these is less familiar. The Great War's semi-modernization. The classic World War I of, again, myth and memory, could in fact only be waged in a limited area. The flexibility I mentioned earlier could only be applied in a narrow belt in Western Europe, maybe vertically 500 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and fundamentally and horizontally, anywhere from 50, 60 to 100 miles on either side of the line. It's like a strip. I had one of my colleagues talk about it as being a kind of military edge city. And if you're talking about flexibility, even semi-modern war, that is where the only place, the only zone it can be raised. Try this elsewhere, and you run into immediate problems. German operations in Russia and the Balkans in 1914, 1915 depend heavily on technology as a force multiplier. They use machines broadly defined, to match the to compensate for the numbers they don't have. And those operations are constantly frustrated by technology's limits in an Eastern context. Heavy guns are handicapped because there are no paved roads over which to move them. Rapid-firing small arms, machine guns, require large-scale, predictable resupply that is not always forthcoming. Aircraft effectiveness is limited by short-range, mechanical fragility, poor bombs, and not least the lack of any supporting civil infrastructure for where you can provide mechanical services, bases and bases, this sort of thing. In other words, the semi-modern wars, or I should say in consequence, the semi-modern wars waged outside of Northern Europe tend towards an entropy of demodernization. That you start in the middle and you start going down. Peacetime armies and their cadres in these expanded areas of war melt away in combat. They're submerged by repeated infusions of unprepared conscripts. They see their support systems erode, collapse from overstretch. Russia and the Balkans, the Middle East and East Africa offer a plethora of case studies. In Russia, combatants are sent to the front, infantrymen are sent to the front without rifles. In Mesopotamia, 1915, the British medical services break down to a point that harks back to the Crimea. In East Africa, the tsetse fly dismounts whole cavalry regiments. The horses simply catch fever and die. Nor, I might add, is this demodernization confined to combat zones. Russia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, even Italy, strained themselves to the breaking point and beyond in coping with the demands of this enduring war that, if not total, in the sense we think of it, is certainly absolute war. Nothing like it had ever been seen in Europe. Infrastructures outside of the semi-modern zone in the West. Infrastructures from railroads to hospitals to bureaucracies that had functioned reasonably competently up to 1914 see their levels of performance and their levels of competence tested to destruction. Stress combined with famine and plague to nurture catastrophic levels of disorder, ranging from the Armenian genocide to the Bolshevik Revolution. So the flexibility then of desperation and demodernization through expansion. And these two combine to pose a fundamental challenge to the wartime relationships of armed forces and governments to their peoples. As I mentioned, in 1914, for practical purposes, the warring states turn over control to the generals. As the war progresses, the governments attempt to assert more control, to offer alternate situations, which generates rivalry. And we know the results. In Germany, the military's control metastasized after 1916 into a de facto dictatorship. But that dictatorship was contingent on a victory that the German armed forces couldn't deliver. In France and Britain, civil and military authorities, beginning in 1915, come to a more or less sustainable modus vivendi that endures to the armistice, but endures just barely. In some respects, the French mutinies of 1917 segue into what amounts to a truly empty battlefield in late 1918, as the French army is simply running out of men to a point where they are intending for the next year of the war, 1919, to replace 1/3 of their infantry regiments by regiments of North Africans, North African conscripts, Algerians, Sub-Saharan Africans. I might add, that is why they were so glad to get those 4 black regiments that General Pershing didn't want. You know, they used them as fillers, not, as some of our mythology has it, as frontline shock troops. But again, France is simply running out of men. Great Britain has reduced the size of its fighting force by 25% in the spring of 1918, in February 1918. By the end of the war, they are literally, they're literally just plugging holes with anybody that they can find. Even the Americans, who are expected to make up this shortfall, have not yet been able to do it. And certainly, as far as the French and British governments are concerned, the durability of their civil military population, Clausewitzian triads, the durability over a longer run is considered best untested. So in contemplating future wars, a process which well antedates November 11th, 1914, soldiers and politicians alike face a disconcerting fact. The Great War's true turning point comes for any state when its people hate their governments more than they fear their enemies. And from there, it's just a matter of whose clock runs out first. Russia, Austria, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and again, France and Britain are certainly unwilling to make that test. They are perfectly pleased to settle the war as a compromise. So, World War I then is a mass war whose shaping, the flexibility of desperation, the demodernization of expansion, creates and leaves unsolved 2 fundamental questions. First, how could the next war be not necessarily shortened, but be fought so as to avoid stalemate and its consequences? The 2 things we tried, flexibility and expansion, have now worked in context. And how could public support for a long, demanding conflict best be generated and sustained? Now again, the Great War was never seen as a war to end war, except by a few idealists of the Woodrow Wilson mentality, by either states or armed forces. And the conflict's legacies, how do we deal with these 2 questions? How do we deal with these 2 questions? Let me make sure I read them correctly. How can we avoid stalemate and its consequences? And how can we keep our people up to the mark while we're solving that problem? Those two questions dominate military and political thinking in the interwar years, and to a significant effect during World War II as well. And it seems to me that the common denominator of those questions is a recognition that effective future war making depends on a synergy between an effective government and a strong citizenry, and on synergizing operationally mass and impulsion, to overcome the flexibility problem. All the rest could be developed, and implied. Could be developed or implemented in that context. If you've got a synergy between the government and its citizenry, and a synergy of mass and impulsion, force and impulsion. How did Europe and the woke rest of the world respond to those questions? A good question. That is a good question itself, but it is the subject for another discussion at another meeting, preferably up here, one on the genesis and nature of World War II. And in that context, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention, and I want to know how much of this you'll let me get away with. Of course, there's plenty of time for it.
Okay. Professor Showalter is willing to take some questions. There's some mics set up. Does anyone have a specific query? Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you very much. Can you spend a few minutes and bring us up to speed on the state of the Chinese military, their developments, their warships, aircraft, etc.?
During the First World War period, the period of this discussion, or
today?
It's a little off track, but I don't mind doing it. What is remarkable has been, again, China's emergence as an industrial and a high-tech power. One of the things that was characteristic of China's military really through World War II was that it was a mass army, a peasant army, an army that depended mostly for its weapons and for many of its ideas on the West. This carried through, certainly through the Korean War, and arguably into the 1950s and 1960s, where the Chinese Red Army was used as much as an agricultural labor force as a military force, used as the People's Army. Well, with the end of the Glorious Revolution and the reconfiguration, shall we say, of China's economy and China's political situation, first off, you see demobilization. You see cutting back the mass. And secondly, you see a growing emphasis, particularly in the Air and Navy, on high-tech power projection. It's easiest to spot in the Navy because we have more pictures and more statistics on Chinese warships. They're good. They're very good. As good as anything you see in South Asia, pretty much as good as anything we have. Their air forces, again, it's a little harder to track, but certainly they are far from the improvised force that we chewed up pretty badly in Korea in 1950-51. And I think it's safe to say that the Chinese Army, both as a modern high-tech mechanized force, is both a modern high-tech mechanized force, and it has retained its ability to make physical war, as well as they did in Korea. They certainly went through the Indians like a dose of salt in the 1960s, and I have no sense that India is anxious to push this current confrontation seriously, any more than we are with North Korea. It's also safe to say that India, the second great military power in South Asia, is putting an awful lot into comprehensive military modernization. And they're not doing that because of their own ambitions for conquest, as opposed to their ongoing tension with Pakistan. I think it's being done for security and expressing determination, really, to maintain India and to sustain India against China. Reasonable answer, sir? That's about the best. And again, I'd say, particularly in the maritime area, you can see the quality of the ships. You can see what they can do, and it's very rare for a state to have a navy that is that exponentially superior to its armed forces, particularly a continental power like China, if you get my drift. They've always been a land power rather than a sea power. So one is likely to match the other. If nothing else, the rivalries between Army, Navy, and Air Force will see to it that the budgets are pretty well spread out. Okay? Anybody else?
Colin has a question.
I'm sorry,
Go ahead, Colin. I see him.
I'm over here. So I'm,
my apologies, the lights are shining here and I.
no worries at all. So I am going to impose a little bit on your last statement about that's a topic for another meeting. But I'm interested if you might talk a little bit about the differences between Imperial Russia and Soviet Russia, specifically with what you said in your concluding remarks, that that balance between hating the enemy less than you hate your government and pushing it. And I wonder if you might comment a little bit or just talk a little bit about the difference between those two governments.
I thank you indeed with great pleasure. It's clear that by 1916, the Tsarist Russia had exhausted its credibility with its armed forces and with its people as well. Not only was it a military problem, but Russia's infrastructure was shaking, was pretty much on the edge of collapse, not least because what I call Russia's crust of competence had been fractured. Every society has a crust of competence, a crust of people who can see that the hypodermic needles are clean, that the trains run on time, that deliveries are made, that the mail is delivered. See what I'm driving at? We don't think about it this much because our crust of competence has always been, for generations, layers thick. Russia's was slim, Russia's was thin, and the war broke that in the same way that you can break the crust on baked goods or on a casserole. And so you're falling apart internally, and you're falling apart externally. And the government was able neither, you might say the establishment, was able neither to reform itself through the imperial system, nor, when the Tsar finally abdicated, nor could the Kerensky system reform itself, not least because Kerensky and his supporters, or I should say the new government led by Kerensky, you wouldn't call Kerensky a charismatic leader, felt that it was important to maintain credibility with the Western allies so you could get loans, so that you could get the resources that you'd need to build up the country. Make sense? And again, put those two together, and it didn't take much also for the discipline of the army to erode badly. One thing that's characteristic of any good army, particularly us, the Germans, the French, never give an order won't be obeyed. And this was the biggest problem of Russian front line, and the Russian front line, and in the Russian rear areas. An officer would give an order, and the answer would be blank you. Quite often the case. And well, you could add it up. You have a Nagant revolver with 7 rounds. There's 50 of them. What exactly do you do? Well, the answer is, assuming you can back off with a little dignity, you don't give any more orders. Make sense? Now, I would say up to World War II, coming up to World War II, the Soviet government is solid enough, imposed enough, that it doesn't have these kinds of issues of disloyalty or disaffection. The risks of disaffection, whether in the civil population or the military, are too high. Now, Solzhenitsyn asked the question, you may be familiar with this, he said, why didn't we do something when the cars came at night, the trucks came at night? Why didn't we throw pots and pans at them? Well, that's a good question when you're in the gulag. Those things, even for a man of courage and honor like Solzhenitsyn, it's easier to talk about than to do. So the element of control is strong enough. And I think it is fair to say that even in the darkest days of 1941, the Red Army does not erode the way its Tsarist predecessor did. The number of prisoners taken were a function of the number taken was a function of the blitzkrieg rather than of declining morale. And I would say that by December 1941, it was spreading pretty rapidly through the Red Army that there was nothing wrong with Russia that Adolf Hitler was going to fix. Make sense? The other thing that kept it going, and I certainly recommend here Catherine Merridale's Ivan's War on this. She was the first scholar, a British historian, the first scholar who could get Soviet veterans to talk to her in the early 1990s. And time and again, they would say, we fought the war because we expected something better to come out of it. They fought, in some ways at least, they had almost a parallel attitude to their American counterparts. American GIs fought the war in the expectation that things would be better than they had been in the Depression, that things would be better overall, and that we sustained that hope in a different way. But of course, as I say, I think this had a lot to do with keeping the Red Army in the field. And the third thing that, so far so good, sir? The third thing that, yes?
That because there's an extraordinary oral history of Stalingrad that has been uncovered in the last 10 or 15 years, which really reinforces your point.
Exactly.
You tend to think that they were just coerced, but there was tremendous pride in that country.
Exactly. And a sense of pride, a sense of necessity, and a sense of desperation. You know, you stop and think, the Red Army fought its way back into Germany across territory the Germans had devastated. And, to borrow a phrase, payback's a bitch. You know, you didn't have to encourage the ordinary soldiers of the Red Army to plunder, to rape. Many of them were men who had been drafted in from these liberated areas. You know, again, the early war veterans were dead or promoted, and most of them had their own payoffs to do. I remember talking to a German woman, interviewing her, and she got to talking a little bit, and she said, I stopped counting at 65 because I was afraid I'd go mad. The reference, of course, was the number of men that had raped her in one situation. Now, again, this was a construction, if you get my drift, a constructed memory she was sharing with an interviewer, a foreigner she didn't know, but I think we can use it as a trope or a meme. Fair enough? They had grudges. They had their own grudges to pay. And I'll tell you something else. For a lot of these Rotarmisten, the fact that these goddamn blank Germans were living so well, they all had watches, they all had flush toilets, they all had things that many of the younger men, the men 30 and under, had never seen. And there was a very real sense, if you will, of victimization. A very real sense of victimization that again facilitated a, if you will, a ferocity. And then, of course, the point I wanted to mention, I didn't want to talk over you, but the last thing is the Soviet Army, by 1944 certainly, has developed a culture of competence. The ordinary Red Army grunt had a sense that the system knew what it was doing, which was not necessarily true, not true at all. Probably the best book you can get on this is David Glantz's thing on Rzhev, the battle that was just buried, submerged. There are a couple of others, but Dave is the best, on a system that, you know, the Russians just spilled blood because even Zhukov couldn't think of anything else to do. Reasonable answer, sir? I got a problem. Somebody asked me what time it is. I tell them how to make a watch. But it's a good question that, deserved, and again, can make a damn interesting lecture for this program.
I see Professor Fritz lurking at the microphone.
Yes, sir. And again, I'm sorry, I can't see a damn thing.
That's all right.
Thanks, if you will.
You don't have to see me, just hear me, okay? I want to know, sir, if you think that the outcome of the Great War made the Second World War inevitable, and if the situation would have been any different had the United States ratified the Treaty of Versailles.
Answer, no in both cases.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's a quick answer. It's no in both cases. No wars, Harry. No war is inevitable till it starts. And there are a lot of turning points. There are a lot of turning points.
The biggest one is the Great Depression.
That certainly counts. And the inability of the Versailles government to exdigitate and establish itself in a stable fashion. And of course, appeasement. Which an appeasement is the normal way of conducting diplomacy. We're hearing now people saying, well, the last three administrations did nothing but appease North Korea. Well, that's the normal way you do politics. Like Trump would say, you find out what the other guy will take, then you see what you can get him to take. But appeasement only works in a context of being willing to appease, to be appeased. And Hitler obviously was. Pardon? Yeah, exactly. The French say that in every relationship there is one who adores and one who condescends to be admired. And I think that this was true with appeasement in the 30s. Fair enough, sir? Yes.
Firstly, given the twin pressures you described, domestic discontent versus hatred of the enemy, does this factor into John J. Pershing's thinking and planning? And secondly, extrapolating, how do we properly evaluate John J. Pershing today, a figure who's hailed as the next coming of Washington, Jackson, and U.S. Grant in the 1920s, but in 2017 is hard-pressed to find name recognition outside of the people who come to these lectures?
Yeah, well, as I think you know, in more recent years, Pershing has been sharply criticized, particularly for his belief in open warfare tactics, skirmishing, this sort of thing. He fits very well, I think, into the concept. In fact, Pershing was one of the guys who inspired my concept of desperate flexibility. Pershing saw what was true, that unless the trench dynamic could be changed, you're going to bleed a lot for no reason. Now, the problem was, how do you make that happen? And had Pershing, and I think we must remember that Pershing's army in 1917 is completely improvised compared to what we sent to war in World War II. Most American soldiers sent into Tunisia, sent into the South Pacific in 1942, had been in uniform for a couple of years. They'd been trained, they'd been disciplined, they had some doctrine to work with. A lot of American, hell, I had an uncle who told me he made and again, this may be a soldier's talk, but he said, I used to make $5 a pop showing these guys how to load their rifles. They'd been drafted, put into uniform. Many of them couldn't speak English, or couldn't speak English, beyond, just enough to get by in an everyday job. So they couldn't understand orders. They did a lot of close order drill, but they never learned how to load their rifles. Now again, that story may be a canard, but my uncle certainly believed it, and Mac Kaufman thought it was true enough to put it in a couple of his books. But this gives you an idea. It's also true that the American Army was very semi-modern in terms of its equipment. We depended on the French for everything. And it was equally true, and this is Ed Lengel's point, that the American Army in 1918 wasn't willing to learn a hell of a lot from the French. We thought we knew it all. And the Germans showed us different. The Germans will teach you how to make war, but the tuition is god-awful high. And this was certainly the case. We learned. We had a high learning curve, but, as I say, I think Pershing has taken a bad rap for his idea. Implementing it with open order tactics and inadequate firepower in the Argonne is operationally extremely, extremely poor. But I can't think of anyone who would have done better in that situation. that the American Army could have produced, and I can't think of anybody in the Allied or German side who would have handled it any better either. Is that reasonable? That's about the best I can tell you.
Dennis, we have another question. We have time, I think, for one more question, please.
Okay.
Well, since the Germans were originally the attackers on the Western Front, as far as the big front went, they were able to pick and choose their defensive positions a bit more selectively and dig in a lot more in places, whereas the Allied lines were more fluid because they were trying to push the Germans out of France.
Yeah.
How did that affect, like, German supply lines and logistics as opposed to the Allied?
German what? I'm sorry.
Supply lines and whatnot, like getting equipment to the front.
I would
opposed to
say,
France.
and again, here I can give you a new book to read, the diaries of the great German tactician of World War I, Lossberg, has just been, his memoir has just been translated by Dave Zabecki. And you chew your way through that. And I think the Germans used their defensive positions as a force multiplier, because always they were fighting a poor man's war. They were fighting a poor man's war, particularly in terms of the material war, the mechanized war that World War II, the World War I turned into. And I think they were never much able to get beyond that. Does that make sense? You know, they were never able to take full operational advantage of their better defensive positions, their simple ability to dig in more. And again, of course, any reading you've done on the Somme will be a good illustration of that. They'd had 2 years to dig in, and they did it magnificently. The British shelled them for a week, and by and large, they were still able to man their weapons. But that, to repeat my point, was a force multiplier. Fair enough? Mm-hmm. I don't think they can make it. They can make it work in any strong operational context. Best here too is, quote Dave Zabecki again, his book on the German offensives in 1918 is not for the faint of heart, unless you're a bit of an operational art junkie. But it's worth looking at least his intro and conclusions. You know, he tips his hand in both of them, as a good author will. So rather than try to chew your way through his prose and his maps, you might try that for a good example. Fair enough?
Yep, thank you very much.
Surely, my pleasure. Okay?
Yes, can we give